I spent years giving my all to someone who couldn't even see me anymore. As a father, I dedicated everything to him. My time, my energy, my sacrifices. I thought love was enough, that my presence would be enough to keep us connected. But as time went on, I began to feel invisible. My son, the one I worked tirelessly for, started to push me away. He became distant, cold, even, no longer needing me, no longer wanting me. It crushed me, but I didn't want to admit it. I kept trying, kept fighting to reach him, but the harder I tried, the further he drifted. I watched him grow into the man I had hoped he'd become, but without me. His world expanded, his life filled with friends, dreams, ambitions, while mine shrank, limited to nothing more than the occasional text or phone call that barely lasted a minute. I wasn't the dad he once needed, and somewhere along the way, I stopped being the man I used to be. My love, my devotion, meant nothing to him. One day, I couldn't take it anymore. I made a decision that would change everything. I walked away. I left behind the years of sacrifices, the hopes I had for us, and started a new life. Alone, in peace. What happened next? Well, my son came running back, begging for my forgiveness. But I wasn't waiting anymore. The question now was it too late to fix what had been broken? Could he really understand the cost of what he had done? Asterisk. This hook introduces an emotional narrative filled with love, betrayal, and a pivotal turning point, creating an instant connection with viewers. It sets up a journey of discovery, self-respect, and redemption that will unfold throughout the video. Brian wasn't born into wealth or privilege. In fact, his childhood was nothing short of difficult. Raised in a small, modest house on the outskirts of a bustling city, Brian knew early on that life wasn't going to hand him anything. His parents had worked tirelessly to make ends meet, and the long hours his father spent in a factory and his mother in a small grocery store were the foundation upon which Brian's values were built. Hard work, sacrifice, and love. That's what his parents taught him, and it was all Brian knew to pass on to his own children. As a young man, Brian had dreams, big dreams. He wanted to see the world, experience adventure, and chase after passions he could never afford. But when Tommy was born, everything changed. In an instant, he wasn't just a young man anymore. He was a father, and that came with responsibilities. The dreams of exploring the world faded into the background as he focused on providing for his family. Brian worked long hours as a mechanic, often taking on extra shifts, fixing cars in the evenings just to make sure Tommy had everything he needed. He was determined to give his son the opportunities he never had, even if it meant sacrificing his own dreams. He wanted Tommy to have a future where he could pursue his passions, make his own choices, and never have to worry about where the next meal would come from. Tommy's early years were filled with moments of joy and love. Brian remembered the days when his son's laughter echoed through their small house, when he would sit on the couch and read him stories or teach him how to fix things around the house. Those moments of connection were everything to Brian, proof that his sacrifices were worth it. He was proud of the man he was becoming as a father. But somewhere along the way, things began to change. Tommy grew up fast. He started to spend more time with friends, and the distance between them grew. At first, Brian thought it was just a phase. Boys go through changes, he told himself. Teenagers want independence. But the phase stretched on longer than he expected. What had been small moments of rebellion and independence turned into a deeper, more painful disconnect. The phone calls became fewer. The texts went unanswered. When Brian asked Tommy to spend time with him, the response was always the same: "I'm busy, Dad." It wasn't just the physical distance. It was the emotional distance that hurt the most. Tommy's attitude toward Brian started to shift. No longer was he the eager child who wanted to learn from his father. No longer did he come to him for advice or guidance. Instead, Brian was met with cold indifference. And that hurt more than anything, more than the long hours, more than the lack of recognition for his hard work. He had poured his heart and soul into Tommy's upbringing, yet nothing seemed to matter. It was as if he had become a ghost in his own home. Brian's world shrank, and with it, so did his sense of self-worth. He began to question everything he had done. Was he not good enough? Had he failed as a father? The doubts started to creep in slowly at first, but they grew louder with each passing year. Tommy, who had once been his pride and joy, had become a stranger, a person who seemed more interested in his own life than in the man who had given him everything. It was during these lonely nights that Brian truly began to feel the weight of it all. He would sit in the quiet of the living room, the house eerily silent without the sounds of Tommy's laughter or footsteps. The silence was deafening. His life had become a routine. Wake up, work, come home, eat dinner alone, go to bed. The occasional text or brief phone call from Tommy was the only connection he had left. It wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough. One evening, after Tommy had failed to show up for their planned dinner, something inside Brian snapped. He had made excuses for Tommy's behavior for so long, telling himself it was just part of growing up, but deep down, he knew that wasn't true anymore. This wasn't a phase. This wasn't temporary. Tommy wasn't coming back to the man who had given everything for him. The thought struck Brian like a thunderclap. What if he wasn't the one who needed to change? What if it wasn't his fault? What if for once it was okay to let go? The thought was almost foreign to him. He had always been the one to give, to sacrifice, to fight for the relationship. But what if that wasn't enough? Brian stood in front of the mirror that night, staring at his reflection. The man who had worked so hard, the man who had sacrificed so much, was barely recognizable to him anymore. He was tired. He was exhausted, physically and emotionally. The weight of all the years of unappreciated love hung heavy on his shoulders. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. He realized he could no longer chase after someone who didn't want him in their life. He had given everything he had to Tommy, and now it was time to give something to himself. Brian packed his things quietly that night, taking only what he could fit into a suitcase. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew one thing. He couldn't stay in that house any longer. The memories, the empty promises of connection, were too much. He needed to find peace again, and he wouldn't find it by waiting for a son who wasn't coming back. The small town he moved to was far from glamorous. It wasn't a place full of excitement or adventure. It was quiet, peaceful. It offered Brian the solitude he so desperately needed. He rented a small cottage on the outskirts of town, surrounded by nature. It was a far cry from the bustling life he once had, but it was a fresh start, and for the first time in years, Brian felt a sense of peace settle in his chest. In that small town, he found new friends, new routines, and new experiences. He learned to embrace the quiet, to reconnect with himself. He wasn't just a father anymore. He was Brian, the man who could find joy in the simple things again, the sunsets, the mornings spent with a cup of coffee, the long walks by the lake. Life was still worth living, even without his son in it. But Tommy's absence weighed on him. No matter how much peace he found in solitude, a part of him still longed for the son he had once known. Would he ever understand what he had done? Would he ever realize what it cost to lose someone who had given everything for him? Only time would tell. The first few weeks in the small town felt like a breath of fresh air for Brian. He spent his mornings walking through the quiet streets, exploring the woods nearby, and even starting to enjoy hobbies he had neglected for years. He joined a local community group that met every Wednesday evening, where people gathered to share stories and provide mutual support. It was a place where no one knew his past, no one judged him, and for the first time in years, Brian felt a sense of belonging. But despite all of this, there was a constant ache in his heart, an emptiness he couldn't quite shake. He could feel the absence of Tommy like an open wound. The loneliness didn't seem as harsh now, but the longing for his son was still there, gnawing at him in quiet moments. He found himself questioning, was it all worth it? Was it all worth leaving behind the life I knew just to escape the pain of being ignored? The phone calls from Tommy still came sporadically, once every few weeks, sometimes longer. The conversations were always brief, and there was always a sense of distance in Tommy's voice, as if he were speaking to someone he barely knew. Every time Brian picked up the phone, he hoped that this call would be different. He hoped that this time, Tommy would sound like the son he remembered, the one who would talk to him for hours, the one who looked to him for guidance. But instead, he heard the same indifferent tone, the same disconnection. "Hey, Dad. Just calling to check in. How's everything?" Tommy's voice always sounded robotic, almost as if he were reading from script. Brian could feel his heart sink every time he heard that flat tone. The father in him wanted to reach out, to connect, to bridge the gap between them. But the man who had walked away, who had found some semblance of peace in his own solitude, knew that this wasn't just a phase anymore. This was real. Tommy had shut him out, and no matter how hard Brian tried, he couldn't get through the wall Tommy had built around himself. One evening, as Brian sat in the small cottage by the fireplace, the phone rang again. He hesitated for a moment, his finger hovering over the receiver. He knew this call would be no different, but something in him pushed him to answer. "Hello," Brian said, trying to mask the hesitation in his voice. "Dad, it's me." Tommy's voice came through, more strained than usual. I need to talk to you." Brian's heart skipped a beat. There was something different in Tommy's voice, a crack he hadn't heard in a long time. For a brief moment, a flicker of hope ignited in him. Could it be? Could his son finally be ready to talk? To come back? "Tommy, it's good to hear from you," Brian said, trying to keep his voice calm, neutral. "What's going on?" I don't know how to say this, but I need your help," Tommy said, the words tumbling out quickly, almost in a panic. "I'm in trouble, Dad. I messed up, and I don't know who else to turn to." The shock hit Brian like a punch to the gut. His first instinct was to jump to action, to help his son, to step in and be the father he had always been. But then, reality hit. This wasn't the first time Tommy had turned to him in a crisis. This wasn't the first time Tommy had needed help and expected Brian to drop everything for him. And yet, over the years, every time Brian had been there for Tommy, it had been a one-sided relationship. Brian had given, and Tommy had taken, without ever truly appreciating what Brian had sacrificed. Brian took a deep breath, trying to steady his emotions. "What kind of trouble are you in, Tommy?" There was a long pause before Tommy spoke again, his voice quieter now. I lost my job, Dad. I've been trying to make ends meet, but it's just not working. I can't pay the bills. I'm behind on everything, and I don't know what to do." Brian felt a pang of sympathy, but it was mixed with frustration. This is exactly what I've been trying to avoid, he thought. I've given everything for this kid, and now he's asking me to fix his mistakes again. Has he learned nothing? For a moment, he considered hanging up. He didn't want to be that crutch for Tommy anymore. He didn't want to be the one who always picked up the pieces when things fell apart. But then, as if on autopilot, Brian asked, "How much do you need, Tommy?" "I need enough to get back on my feet. Maybe a few thousand, just to cover the rent and some bills until I find another job." Tommy's voice was pleading now, his usual arrogance gone. Brian's fingers tightened around the phone. He could feel the weight of Tommy's request pressing down on him. He had every right to say no, to let Tommy face the consequences of his own actions. But a part of him, the father part, was still there, hoping that helping Tommy would somehow bring them back together. "I can't give you that kind of money, Tommy," Brian said, his voice steady but firm. "You got to figure this out on your own. I've done enough. I've been there for you your whole life, and it's time for you to take responsibility." There was silence on the other end. Brian's heart raced as he wondered what Tommy's reaction would be. Would he lash out? Would he finally understand? Would this be the moment that changed everything? But instead of the anger or frustration Brian expected, Tommy's voice cracked. I understand, Dad. I didn't know who else to call. I've messed up so many times, and I know you're probably done with me. I don't expect you to fix this, but I just thought you should know what's going on." The words hung in the air, heavier than any insult or demand Tommy had ever made. Brian's chest tightened as he realized the gravity of the situation. His son was asking for help, but this time, it wasn't just about the money. It was about the relationship. It was about the broken bond that had frayed over the years, and Brian's refusal to keep putting his heart on the line. "I'll always love you, Tommy, but I can't keep doing this. I can't keep fixing everything for you. You got to learn to stand on your own." The call ended with a hollow click, and Brian stared at the phone for what felt like an eternity. The decision had been made. The emotional toll of it all, the years of sacrifice, the endless attempts at connection, had led to this moment. Tommy had to face the consequences of his actions, on his own. But deep inside, Brian wondered, Had he done the right thing? Was this really the end? Brian stood in the middle of the small cottage, the phone still in his hand, the silence in the room so thick it felt suffocating. His heart was pounding and his mind was racing. The decision to let Tommy go, to refuse to bail him out for the thousandth time, felt like the hardest thing he'd ever done. He had always been there for Tommy, but now, it seemed like that very act of being there had led to a deep well of resentment that neither of them knew how to fill. He dropped the phone onto the couch and sat down, burying his face in his hands. His emotions swirled in a vortex of frustration, regret, and guilt. Had I failed him? Was I too harsh? The questions bounced around his mind, but the truth kept rising to the surface. Every time Tommy needed him, Brian had stepped in. But with each intervention, with every moment of support he offered, Tommy had become more distant, more self-centered. Now, it seemed that Tommy only came around when things went wrong, when he was in trouble. That realization stung more than anything. I was only valued in his life when he needed something. Brian had thought walking away would bring him peace, but instead, it made him confront something much darker. The hollow ache of being unloved, of having given everything without receiving anything in return. For all the sacrifices, all the years of hard work, it felt like Brian had never mattered enough to Tommy. He had never been more than a utility, a provider, someone who could be counted on only when it was convenient. The emotional toll was breaking him slowly, and no amount of distance or solitude seemed to ease the pain. Tommy's voice echoed in his head. I didn't know who else to call. Those words cut deeper than any argument or silent treatment. They weren't just a cry for help. They were a silent admission of neglect. The man who had raised him, loved him, been there for every scraped knee, every heartbreak, and every triumph, was now the person Tommy was calling on only when everything else had fallen apart. How had it come to this? Brian's thoughts shifted to the years they had spent together. The memories of Tommy as a child, the way his eyes would light up when Brian showed him how to fix a car engine or how to hammer in a nail, were still fresh in his mind. Those were the moments that had kept Brian going, the moments that made him believe, I'm doing this for him. He'll be grateful one day. But now, it seemed like all those years had been erased, all those precious memories swept away by the tide of distance and indifference. The phone call had been the final blow. In some way, Brian had known that Tommy would never come back to him the way he once was. That part of their relationship, that closeness, had long since evaporated. But hearing the desperation in Tommy's voice, the crack that had been there, barely noticeable at first, made the realization hit him harder than ever. Tommy was broken, and for the first time, Brian understood the weight of what he had lost. He wasn't just losing a son who had become distant. He was losing a version of himself, a part of him that had always been attached to the identity of fatherhood, to the role of protector and provider. Tommy's mistakes were his own to bear, but Brian couldn't help but wonder how much of this was his fault. Had he made a mistake in being too available, too forgiving? Should he have set clearer boundaries years ago? The guilt gnawed at him, making him question every choice he had ever made. But even as he wrestled with these thoughts, Brian knew one thing for certain. He couldn't keep sacrificing his own happiness for a relationship that no longer existed. The isolation he had felt in the small cottage began to feel suffocating again. Brian wanted to pick up the phone, call Tommy back, and undo everything he had just done. But he couldn't. He had to hold firm. He had to let Tommy face the consequences of his own actions. No matter how painful it was, he couldn't be the crutch anymore. But even with that resolve, a small voice inside him questioned, what if this was the last time? What if he never came back? What if Tommy never understood? The fear of losing him entirely weighed heavily on Brian's chest. It wasn't just about the money or the phone calls. It was about the love, the bond they once shared, and the overwhelming sadness that maybe, just maybe, that bond had been irreparably broken. As the days passed, the tension in Brian's heart grew. The silence in the cottage, which once felt like freedom, now felt like a reminder of everything he had lost. Tommy's absence was no longer a quiet ache. It was a sharp, constant reminder that nothing would ever be the same. The conflict between holding on and letting go tore at him, leaving him exhausted both mentally and emotionally. He didn't know what to do anymore. Was he being too hard on Tommy? Or had he finally made the right choice? With each passing day, the stakes of this emotional battle grew higher, and Brian knew that eventually he would have to make a final decision. Would he open his heart once more, despite the pain, or would he finally let go for good? That question lingered in his mind, unresolved as he sat in the quiet of the small cottage, alone. Days turned into weeks, and the emotional storm inside Brian never seemed to settle. Despite his attempts to keep the small-town tranquility intact, every time he went for his walks or sat by the window, his thoughts were clouded with Tommy's voice. I didn't know who else to call. It repeated itself, echoing like a ghost in his mind, dragging him back to the years of unspoken regrets and unsaid words. He had made the decision to cut ties, to stop being the emotional crutch Tommy always leaned on, but every fiber of his being screamed to turn back. It wasn't just about the money or the calls. It was the years that led to this point. Every missed opportunity to connect, every time Brian reached out and was met with silence, had built up like a dam waiting to burst. But now, it felt like that dam had broken, and the flood of emotions had no place to go. He had been Tommy's father, his protector, the one who believed in him no matter what. But Tommy's abandonment had left Brian questioning everything about himself, his role as a father, and even his value as a person. Brian found himself wondering about the bigger picture. Was this a natural part of growing up? Did every parent go through this silent heartbreak as their children grew up and moved on? Or was Tommy's behavior a reflection of his own failure as a father? He'd tried so hard, but had he been too lenient? Too indulgent? There were moments when he questioned if Tommy's distance was a direct result of Brian's own missteps. Had he been too eager to please? Too eager to make up for the mistakes of his own parents? He had worked so hard for Tommy to have a better life than he did, never knowing the sting of rejection, always surrounded by love. But in the process, had Brian inadvertently created a dependency? Had he inadvertently made Tommy feel like he never had to stand on his own 2 feet because his father would always be there to catch him? The weight of this realization gnawed at Brian as he sat at the small kitchen table, the faint light of the evening sun casting long shadows on the walls. There had been no more phone calls since the one in which Tommy had asked for help. Brian knew Tommy was struggling, but the idea of stepping in again, giving him what he needed without understanding why it was never enough, left Brian feeling trapped in a cycle he wasn't sure how to break. Each day, his resolve weakened. There were moments when he found himself dialing Tommy's number, his thumb hovering over the call button. What if this was the moment Tommy truly understood? What if he finally came back and apologized for all the hurt he had caused? But then, a cold reality would settle over him, reminding him that Tommy hadn't even bothered to reach out after the last call. There were no words of regret, no attempt to fix what was broken, just silence. And that silence had grown louder with every passing day. Brian began to withdraw further into himself. Even the quiet of his small cottage, which had once offered a sense of solace, now felt suffocating. He spent long hours sitting by the window, watching the world outside continue, while his own world remained frozen in time. The community group meetings, which had once felt like a lifeline, started to feel like an obligation. The conversations felt hollow, as if everyone could sense the turmoil inside him. He wanted to talk to someone, to share his pain, but he couldn't bring himself to. How could he explain the emotional betrayal, the heartbreak of being a father to a son who barely remembered his love? The internal conflict was growing unbearable. The pain of missing Tommy was overwhelming, but so was the fear of being trapped in a cycle of emotional manipulation and neglect. He had tried everything. He had given Tommy everything, and yet here he was alone. The emotional stakes were higher than ever. Brian knew that if he went back to Tommy now, it would be like opening the floodgates, letting everything he had worked so hard to protect drown him once again. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that by walking away, he was closing the door on something that could never be opened again. Would he ever be able to forgive himself if he let Tommy slip further away? What if this was the final straw, the point of no return? Brian had always believed in second chances, but now he was starting to wonder if second chances only worked when both parties were willing to meet halfway. Was Tommy even willing to fight for their relationship? Or was he content to let it drift into oblivion, thinking it would always be there when he needed it? The emotional stakes were no longer just about his son's mistakes or his own role as a father. They were about his identity, his peace of mind, and his ability to move forward. Brian couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, the hardest thing he had to do wasn't walking away from Tommy, but learning to live with the fact that some relationships are beyond repair. And that realization hurt more than any rejection ever could. With each passing day, Brian was forced to confront the painful truth. He could no longer live in the shadow of what he had hoped for. He had to choose his own peace, his own growth, even if it meant leaving Tommy behind. It was a cold morning when Brian received the letter. He hadn't expected it, hadn't even thought of the possibility. The letter, neatly folded and written in Tommy's familiar handwriting, was waiting for him on the small table by the door when he returned from his morning walk. He had been trying to clear his head, to take in the crisp, fresh air that had always given him a moment of peace. But that morning, the air felt heavy, as though the weight of everything, of all the months of silence, the emotional distance, was pressing down on him. He stared at the envelope for a long time, his heart pounding as memories of Tommy flooded back. His laughter, his first steps, the way he'd looked up at Brian with wide, trusting eyes. It felt like another lifetime ago. For a moment, Brian stood frozen, unsure whether he should open it, unsure whether he even wanted to know what was inside. But the urge to know, to understand, was too powerful. He had been waiting for something, anything from Tommy. Maybe this was the moment that would finally bring him clarity. Maybe this letter would be the answer to everything. The answer he had been desperately searching for since the first phone call. He opened it slowly, his fingers trembling, and began to read. "Dad, I don't even know how to begin this. I've been putting it off for so long, afraid that the words wouldn't come out right. But I need to say them. I need to say sorry. I've spent so many years taking you for granted. You were always there, always ready to help, always willing to do whatever it took to make sure I had everything. And I didn't appreciate it. I never did. I thought you'd always be there. I thought I could keep pushing you away and that you'd still come running when I needed you. But now, I realize how wrong I was. You've always been my father, but I treated you like you were just another person to fill the gaps in my life. I didn't see you as someone who had his own life, his own needs, his own emotions. I thought I could walk all over you, and you'd still be there to pick me up. But you were always so much more than that. I'm sorry for the way I treated you. I'm sorry for the times I took you for granted, for the silence, for the way I shut you out. You gave everything for me, and I never even bothered to say thank you. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I don't even know if you'll ever want to see me again, but I had to say it, because you deserve to know how sorry I am. I'm trying to fix myself, Dad. I don't want to keep making the same mistakes. But I need you to know this. I understand now. I understand the hurt I caused, and I can't take it back. All I can do is be better. I hope, one day, you'll give me the chance to prove it. Tommy." Brian felt the letter slip from his fingers as he finished reading it, his eyes blurry with tears he hadn't expected. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. The words, the raw honesty, the pain and regret that poured out of Tommy's letter were so overwhelming that Brian's chest tightened. He didn't know whether to feel angry, relieved, heartbroken, or hopeful. All he knew was that after months of wondering, months of tormenting himself with what had gone wrong, Tommy's words gave him something he hadn't felt in a long time: clarity. Tommy's letter was a confession, a plea for redemption, but it was also something else. It was a recognition of Brian's worth, a recognition of the father he had been, the love he had given. And it hit Brian in a way nothing else ever could. It was the turning point, the moment of revelation, when Brian realized that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of their story. Maybe it was the beginning of something new, something different, but something that could still be salvaged. For so long, Brian had thought that walking away from Tommy was the answer, that it was the only way to force his son to understand the consequences of his actions. He had been so determined to protect himself, to shield his heart from further pain, that he hadn't considered what this silence, this distance, was doing to Tommy. But now, with this letter, Brian understood. Tommy had finally seen it. He had finally recognized the depth of the hurt he had caused. But what now? What did this mean for Brian, for his peace, for their relationship? He still felt the weight of everything that had happened. The years of sacrifice, the endless disappointment, the years he could never get back. He still didn't know if he could forgive Tommy completely, if he could truly reopen his heart after all the pain. But one thing was clear. Tommy was no longer the same person he had been. Brian sat down on the couch, the letter still in his hands, and closed his eyes. The path forward was no longer as clear as it once seemed. Forgiveness was never an easy choice, and healing was never a straight line. But maybe it was time to stop running from the possibility of repair, to stop protecting himself from the love he still had for Tommy. He didn't know what would happen next, whether Tommy would truly change, whether their relationship would ever be the same again. But for the first time in months, Brian felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Brian had sat in silence for what felt like an eternity after reading Tommy's letter. It was as if time had stopped, and he was stuck in a moment that was too heavy to carry. But gradually, the weight of it all began to settle into something different. Something that wasn't just pain, but a flicker of possibility. His first instinct was to call Tommy immediately, to hear his voice, to see if the words in the letter were really true. But he hesitated. The fear of being hurt again, of diving back into something that could never be fixed, gripped him. For months, he had been trying to protect himself from the emotional devastation Tommy had caused. Could he really allow himself to trust Tommy again? Was forgiveness enough to heal the wounds? Or would this new attempt at connection be just another cycle of disappointment? But despite all the doubts, all the fears, one truth stood out to Brian. He was still a father. And deep inside, that love, the love that had never truly gone away, demanded something more than just emotional self-preservation. It demanded the possibility of healing, the chance to rebuild, if only for the sake of that bond they had once shared. Brian stood up and walked toward the small table by the window where his phone sat. He glanced at the letter one last time, taking in the sincerity in every word, and felt a wave of both relief and uncertainty. Is this what it feels like to finally let go of the past and move forward? He dialed Tommy's number, his hand shaking slightly. The phone rang, and with each second, the anticipation built up like a tight knot in his chest. What if Tommy had changed? What if this was the moment that would bring them back together? And then, the phone clicked, and Tommy's voice came through the line. "Hello." Brian froze for a moment, unsure of what to say. The voice on the other end wasn't the same distant, indifferent tone he had heard for so long. It was softer, filled with uncertainty, as if Tommy was waiting for something, waiting for Brian to say the words that would either heal their relationship or end it for good. "Tommy," Brian's voice cracked, and he took a deep breath before continuing, "I got your letter." There was a pause on the other end, as though Tommy had been bracing for the inevitable. Then, in a quiet voice, Tommy replied, "Dad, I didn't know if you'd ever want to hear from me again. I thought you'd just hate me for everything I've done. I didn't know if I could fix it." Brian's heart squeezed in his chest. It was the first time in so long that he had heard his son's voice, not filled with demands, not filled with distance, but filled with something else, genuine vulnerability. "I don't hate you, Tommy," Brian said slowly, "but you've hurt me more than you'll ever understand." "I know," Tommy replied immediately, "and I'm so sorry. I wish I could take it all back, but I can't. All I can do is ask for your forgiveness and show you that I've changed, that I'm trying. I know it's going to take time, but please, I don't want to lose you. I don't want to keep running away from what we had." The words hit Brian harder than he expected. His mind swirled with the memories of everything he had endured, of the silence, the indifference, the emotional isolation. But in that moment, as Tommy's apology filled the space between them, something began to crack open inside Brian. For the first time, he felt Tommy's sincerity, the raw honesty behind the apology. Maybe he's telling the truth. Maybe he really is trying to change. The thought was almost too much to process. After all the years of feeling taken for granted, it was hard to imagine a world where Tommy truly understood the depth of the hurt he had caused. But at the same time, Brian knew that if he didn't allow this moment to unfold, if he didn't take a step toward healing, he would never know. Tommy, Brian's voice softened. I've spent so much time trying to protect myself, trying to stop myself from feeling this, from feeling anything about what's happened between us. But I can't keep doing that. I don't know if I'm ready to forgive you completely, but I need you to know. I'm here, and I want to try. I want us to try. Tommy's breath caught on the other end of the line. You mean it? He asked, disbelief mixed with relief in his voice. I mean it, Brian said firmly, his voice filled with a strength he hadn't realized he still had. But this is on your shoulders, too. You have to show me that you're ready to rebuild what we lost. I can't carry it all, Tommy. Not anymore. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't filled with the old tension that had hung between them for so long. Instead, it was a shared moment, a fragile but hopeful pause in the middle of everything they had been through. Brian knew that this was the beginning of something new. Not an immediate fix, not a magic solution, but a chance. A chance to rebuild what had been shattered. Tommy's voice broke the silence. I will, Dad. I promise. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, Brian felt something that had been missing for far too long. Hope. The conversation didn't end there, and neither did the emotional wave that Brian felt crashing over him. He wasn't sure what had happened in the moments that followed. It was as if time itself had slowed down, leaving him suspended between the past and whatever the future could hold. The words, I promise, echoed in Brian's mind, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself to believe them. They weren't just words to appease him. They were a declaration, a turning point. Tommy's voice, once filled with anger and detachment, now carried a weight of regret, the kind that could only come from truly realizing the depth of his mistakes. Brian sat back down on the couch, holding the phone tightly, his fingers pressing into the worn plastic of the receiver. A small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. He hadn't realized how desperately he had missed this moment of connection, of being seen for the father he truly was, and not just as a provider or a shadow of the man who had always been there when Tommy needed him. I'm not expecting everything to be perfect, Tommy, Brian said, his voice more steady than he felt. And I'm not going to just forget everything that's happened. I need time. We both need time. But I think we have a chance. A real chance, if we're both willing to work for it. There was a pause, but this time, it didn't feel like the heavy silence of the past. It felt like a moment of mutual understanding, a mutual willingness to move forward. I'll work for it, Dad. I swear. I'll show you that I'm serious about this. I just need you to know that I'm here, trying to be the man you raised me to be. I'm not perfect, but I'm trying to be better. Brian closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of everything settle in. The anger, the frustration, the sadness, all of it felt lighter, almost manageable, like the first steps of a long journey that had finally begun. Maybe this is what I needed, he thought. Not to fix everything, but to stop running from the pain, from the uncertainty. We can't fix the past, but we can shape the future. I know you're trying, Tommy, Brian said, his voice quieter now, full of the weight of years. But you have to understand that it's going to take more than just saying the right things. It's going to take action. It's going to take real work, and it's not going to be easy. For either of us. I know, Dad. I'm ready. I promise. Brian swallowed hard, trying to keep the emotions in check. We'll take it slow, he said, his voice growing firmer. I don't want you to think you can just jump back into my life and everything will be fine. You have to earn this. I have to see in your actions, not just hear it in your words. But I'm willing to give you that chance. We'll take it one step at a time. There was a long silence again, but this one was different. This silence wasn't filled with uncertainty or dread. It was filled with a cautious optimism, a shared agreement that things had changed, even if the road ahead was still unclear. I'll prove it to you, Dad, Tommy said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. I know I've messed up, but I'll do whatever it takes to show you I'm serious. I'm not asking for everything back. I know I don't deserve that, but I want to start over. I want to have a relationship with you again. Brian felt a lump form in his throat, and for a moment he couldn't speak. The simple truth of Tommy's words hit him harder than any argument, any silence, or any distance ever had. Tommy wasn't just asking for forgiveness. He was asking for a chance to rebuild. And that was something Brian hadn't given up on, no matter how broken their relationship had been. I'll be here, Brian finally said, his voice soft but full of resolve. We'll figure this out. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight, but we'll take it one step at a time. Together. Tommy's voice cracked with relief. Thank you, Dad. I can't say how much that means to me. Brian's eyes welled with tears he hadn't expected. For so long, he had built walls around his heart to protect himself from the pain, from the disappointment. But now, standing at the precipice of something new, something raw, unfiltered, and real, he realized that the only way to truly heal was to allow himself to feel the pain, the love, and the hope all at once. Maybe I don't have all the answers, Brian thought, but I'm willing to try. We both are. The weight of the years they had lost together still hung heavy between them. But for the first time, Brian didn't feel like he was carrying it alone anymore. And with that, a new chapter began. I'll be waiting for that change, Tommy, Brian said quietly, but I'm ready for it. Are you? I am, Dad. I really am. As the conversation ended, Brian sat back against the couch, the phone still pressed to his ear. The world outside was still the same, but for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the world inside him was shifting. Tommy was coming back, not just physically, but emotionally. And with that, everything was about to change. Brian didn't know what would come next, but he knew one thing for sure. They had started the hard work. They had started the healing. And that was all he needed for now. In the weeks that followed that phone call, Brian felt the weight of everything shift. The emotional barricades he had built around his heart, the ones he had carefully constructed to protect himself from further pain, began to crumble, slowly but steadily. He had been so focused on what he had lost, on the years of emotional neglect and the endless cycle of disappointment, that he hadn't realized how much he had been holding onto the past. Now, with Tommy's promise hanging in the air, Brian started to consider the future. Tommy kept his word. In the days after their conversation, he showed up at Brian's door, not with excuses or justifications, but with actions, simple, honest efforts to reconnect. He spent time with Brian, slowly rebuilding the bond they had lost over the years. It wasn't easy. There were awkward silences, moments of doubt, and times when the old wounds threatened to reopen. But Tommy was different now. His sincerity was unmistakable. He didn't expect everything to be fixed overnight, but he was there consistently, trying to show his father that he was willing to earn back his trust. Brian, too, made the effort to meet Tommy halfway. He allowed himself to open up, to share the hurt he had felt all those years, but also the love that had never truly faded. He talked about the sacrifices he had made for him, the sleepless nights, the constant worry, and the deep ache of being overlooked. Tommy listened, really listened, and for the first time in a long time, Brian felt like he was truly being heard. He realized that by sharing his pain, he wasn't just protecting himself. He was teaching Tommy the value of empathy, the importance of acknowledging the past in order to move forward. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments when Brian wondered if they would ever fully heal from everything that had happened. But the small steps mattered. Tommy was different. He was learning to stand on his own, to take responsibility for his actions, and to understand the weight of love and sacrifice. Brian could see the change, and he had to admit that there was hope. Hope that their relationship could be rebuilt, not on the foundation of past mistakes, but on mutual respect and effort. One evening, as they sat together on the porch of Brian's cottage, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Tommy turned to him and said something that brought everything full circle. "Dad," he said quietly, "I've been thinking about how much you've done for me. All the things you've sacrificed, the things you've given up. I don't think I can ever repay you for it, but I'm trying to be the man you always hoped I would be." Brian looked at him, his heart swelling with pride and relief. "You don't need to repay me, Tommy. You just need to keep being the person you're becoming. That's all I've ever wanted. And in that moment, Brian knew that this was the beginning of something new. Not a perfect resolution, but a new chapter. There were still challenges ahead. Trust had to be rebuilt, old patterns had to be broken, and wounds had to continue to heal. But they were no longer standing at the edge of the abyss, looking into a future of isolation and regret. They were moving forward together. As Brian looked at Tommy, a flood of emotions surged through him. Love, pride, hope, and the bittersweet sting of what had been lost. But most of all, he felt a sense of peace, a peace that had eluded him for so long. He didn't need everything to be perfect. He didn't need to have all the answers. All he needed was the understanding that they were both trying, that they were both willing to work for this relationship, and that love, though sometimes complicated and painful, was worth fighting for. "Tommy," Brian said, his voice thick with emotion, "I'm proud of you. I don't know where this journey will take us, but I know this. We'll get through it. Together." Tommy smiled, and for the first time in a long time, it wasn't a forced smile or one filled with regret. It was real, and in that moment, Brian knew they had crossed a threshold. They had started the healing process, and while it wouldn't be easy, it was the beginning of something beautiful. In the days that followed, Brian and Tommy continued to rebuild their relationship, taking it one day at a time. There were still bumps in the road, but for the first time in a long time, Brian believed that they could overcome them. The past would always be a part of them, but it no longer defined their future. The final message of their journey was clear. Healing takes time, effort, and vulnerability. But with love, understanding, and a willingness to change, even the deepest wounds can begin to heal. And sometimes, the most powerful moments of growth come when we least expect them. Have you ever faced the heart-wrenching reality of a relationship unraveling, only to wonder if there's any hope of fixing it? Whether it's with a parent, a child, a friend, or someone else close to you, we all go through moments where trust is broken and love feels out of reach. But what if the key to healing isn't found in waiting for the other person to change, but in taking the first step yourself? In today's story, Brian and Tommy found a way back to each other. Not through perfection, but through genuine effort, vulnerability, and the willingness to face the past. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight. But their story reminds us that reconciliation is possible if both sides are committed to understanding, forgiveness, and growth. If you've experienced a similar situation, don't wait for everything to be perfect before reaching out. Sometimes, the hardest part is starting the conversation, even when the future feels uncertain. You don't have to have all the answers, but you can choose to move forward with open arms and an open heart. So what's holding you back from taking that first step? Is it fear, doubt, or pride? It's never too late to heal what's broken, but the time to act is now. If you found inspiration in Brian and Tommy's journey, share your own story in the comments below. How have you worked to heal broken relationships in your life? And remember, if you're ready to see more stories like this one, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Together, we can learn to rebuild, forgive, and create relationships that stand the test of time. Let's keep the conversation going.